Welcome, everybody, to our next lecture, World War II, the Arsenal of Democracy and Racial Justice. This is part one of our lecture on America during World War II, and we begin with the Good War in American memory. And I say Good War because, unlike virtually any other war in which America has fought, the American public's appetite for and enthusiasm for the history and memories and pictures and films relating to World War II is really undiminished. And to understand why, I think we can look at some of those famous pictures. None more famous, really, than what became this Life magazine photo on the occasion of VJ Day in August of 1945. That was victory over Japan at the war's end, and it was here in Times Square that a Time magazine and Life magazine photographer by the name of Alfred Eisenstadt took this picture, which would soon go viral, of an American sailor kissing an American military nurse. As Eisenstadt remembered, he had been standing around taking pictures of the celebration with the news of Japan's surrender when nearly right in front of him, amidst the cheering crowds, this scene unfolded, and he was quick enough to get his camera on it and to immortalize the two then anonymous Americans in perhaps the most famous embrace in America in the 20th century. And it was this passion that seemed to encapsulate this celebration, which seemed to encapsulate America's mood at the end of World War II. If we think about how the war began for America, we can see that it set up right from the start as a kind of righteous crusade. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, were the words uttered by President Franklin Roosevelt in his radio address, in congressional address, on the occasion of the Pearl Harbor attack, an occasion that would bring America now fully into the war, a war that had been going on for the past few years in Europe and in the Far East, a war in which America had remained up to this point officially neutral. With these words, FDR will usher America into the Second World War. And listen to his language here in this famous address. Always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us, no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion. The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. These are words of a righteous crusade. You know, America has fought in many other wars over the years, but none of them were signaled the way Roosevelt's words signaled this one. There was no ambiguity, no difficult policy considerations to somehow explain to the American people. But instead, Roosevelt, as we've learned in some of our other readings, put it to the American people in a way that would be almost not debatable as to the right course of conduct. Actually, the build up to this rhetorical feat, you might say, had begun rather earlier in that year. The four freedoms depicted on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post magazine in February of 1943, that is during the middle of the war, with their evocations of not only the basic constitutional guarantees of American life, but also, as you'll note, a fairly homogeneous depiction of who the American people were. That is, what appeared to be mostly white or Anglo, rather middle class people representing, in the national publication at least, the essential identity of America's freedoms. Now, these illustrations by the artist Norman Rockwell had been taken from a speech that President Roosevelt had given prior to Pearl Harbor, some months prior to Pearl Harbor, what came to be known as the Four Freedoms speech. Roosevelt said that, quote, "In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into universal terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. That is no vision of a distant millennium," said Roosevelt. "It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and generation. That kind of world is the very antithesis of the so-called new order of tyranny which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb." So from January 1941, this excerpt from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's annual message to Congress would come to be known as the Four Freedoms speech. And despite his proclamation that the world would be free of fear, recall it was Roosevelt's stirring address at the outset of his presidency and the Great Depression, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself" speech. His evocation now of freedom from fear, of course, will prove to be somewhat less than prophetic in the short run, given that only 11 months later, the United States would be now entering the Great World War, what comes to be known as World War II, the most violent war with the most bombs and tonnage of bombs of any war up to that point in history. But I think what stands out here as a framing device is Roosevelt's idealism and his positioning of America's commitment in terms of those basic civil liberties, those basic constitutional rights, such as freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religious worship, etc. So that by the time of World War II, that is, by the time of Pearl Harbor, America will be prepared, in effect, in its mindset to understand the cause for which it was fighting. As FDR will put it, we must be the great arsenal of democracy. I want to make it clear that it is the purpose of the nation, said Roosevelt, to build now with all possible speed every machine, every arsenal, every factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We have the men, the skill, the wealth, and above all, the will. So again, soaring rhetoric here, evoking great determination, a kind of single-minded purpose toward what will now be America's entry into World War II. By fashioning it as the great arsenal of democracy, FDR is positioning America now to not simply fight in a war, but to stand for all the very values that our constitutional system and our oft expressed commitment as a nation to democracy would have entailed. Again, all of this building now toward this framing of World War II as the good war. And much of the wartime press and coverage, and for that matter, the governmental propaganda will, of course, support this view of World War II and America's part in it. From the Saturday Evening Post in May of '43, one of the first attempts to extol America's domestic commitment, particularly in the form of Rosie the Riveter, the iconic image that captured America's determination and the determination of American women to build that great arsenal of which FDR spoke. This was another Norman Rockwell image, the same artist who had done the Four Freedoms image, and in addition to the image, songs about Rosie the Riveter, Something True About, Red, White, and Blue About, sang the popular song Rosie the Riveter. And another famous image, the We Can Do It image, also in the vein of the Rosie the Riveter iconography here, with her hair pinned up and her muscles flexed. This was going to be the face of America's female commitment to the good war. Other famous images from the war, another viral photograph, the raising of the American flag on the battle-scarred Pacific island of Iwo from February of 1945. This image will come to represent this image of U.S. Marines at the top of Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima will come to represent again the oneness of purpose and dedication of America's wartime commitment. It will also become a national monument just across the Potomac River from the Lincoln Memorial, the Iwo Jima Marine Corps monument with the enormous figures there drawn from the photograph of the raising of the American flag. Hollywood will get in on the action as well. Movies about the wartime experience included The Sands of Iwo Jima, starring the popular motion picture actor John Wayne. And for many years after, suitably patriotic and stirring accounts like the 1998 film, Academy Award-winning film starring Tom Hanks, that is Saving Private Ryan. One can think about movies in wartime, and you would be hard-pressed to find a greater body of work, on film at least, depicting again that sort of patriotic commitment that unanimous dedication to winning what seemed to be simply the most important war in history, and the movies reflecting that sentiment. If you would compare them, for example, to say the wars or the movies of other wars, such as the Vietnam War, which tended to be, by contrast, much darker, much more conflicted, less optimistic, let's say, than those of World War II. Again, all of this building toward the idea of World War II as the good war. Well, okay, so that's the war in memory, the war on film, the war in speeches, and wartime propaganda. But of course, as historians, we want to compare those images to the historical evidence from the time period to see, where we can find connections, but where we can also perhaps see disconnections, because as is usually the case, the fundamental reality on the ground in America during World War II was really rather more complex, complicated, and even contradictory. So we look at here life during wartime and the struggle for racial justice. The United States government seemed to have learned a lesson from its World War I experience, where so much of the government's propaganda pasted over ethnic and racial diversity in this country, and how the government's wartime loyalty campaigns actually spawned a fair amount of pushback and dissent in World War I. So in World War II, the government takes a different tact. It seems that diversity will be the country's strength during the war, and so we see wartime posters proclaiming "United we win," with two defense factory workers, one white, one black, working shoulder to shoulder on the fuselage of an American military plane. Other similar images, like the billboard here in New York City promoting religious toleration, side by side, says the image, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, so that every person may worship God in his own way. And there, with Mayor LaGuardia of New York, are representatives of different religious faiths in the city. So no fearing diversity here, but embracing it somehow as America's strength. Now, Pearl Harbor, of course, is going to promote a wide variety of mostly emotional responses. And with FDR's famous speech, a great deal of public anger, a kind of rising tide of anger that will vent itself first in the speech of FDR himself, but then increasingly in other areas of American life. The attack on Pearl Harbor is framed not simply as a military attack, but as something far more sinister, a sneak attack, something underhanded, something unjustifiable by the conventional rules of military conflict. Much will be made of the fact that the United States was in negotiation at the time with the Japanese that the Pearl Harbor attack was carried out. And so this depiction of something particularly sinister, as I say, will play a great part then in the public's sort of emotional response. And the anger against the Japanese nation is palpable, is in fact the flames of that anger are fanned at every turn. Posters like this wartime poster asking, "What are you going to do about it?" This targeting now civilians and the government's urging of civilians to stay on the job and to fuel the wartime machinery that would see America avenging. Stay on the job until every murdering Jap is wiped out. It's during World War II that the term Jap, which was simply a shortening, of course, of the term Japanese, is going to become a kind of racial slur, a kind of epithet. And this particular poster was making note of what was happening in the Philippine Islands when the U.S. military force there was caught and cornered by the Japanese military, and the subsequent distress and death that followed in what was known as the Bataan Death March. Images of Japanese soldiers beating captive Americans with their rifle butts. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked, said FDR in his war message. Suddenly and deliberately attacked. And so when you combined all these elements together, you had the kind of, cauldron of anger and hatred in the public sphere. And it really translates into an anger against all things Japanese here in the United States. Here's a Collier's magazine cover from December 13th, 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor, borrowing a character, a ghoulish character from the motion picture The Wizard of Oz, the famous flying monkeys in league with the Wicked Witch in the film The Wizard of Oz, repurposed here now to represent a Japanese bomber plane flying over Pearl Harbor, and the what we might call the the dehumanization or demonization of the Japanese pilot now as a kind of winged bat or monkey creature, something certainly demonic and not really human. Signs were posted, particularly around the West Coast after Pearl Harbor, expressing this virulence, this hatred. We don't want any Japs here ever. Read a typical sign posted in a restaurant or storefront or bus stop, what have you. A real public crusade, you might say, against all things Japanese. And when I say all things, not only the country of Japan, but also increasingly anything connected to Japan or Japanese culture here in the United States, including, as we'll see, Japanese American people. Certainly the propaganda was fueled by the racist perceptions of Asian people and Japanese people that had been in the fabric of the country for some time. It's not Pearl Harbor that will first release these prejudices. It was the immigration of Japanese people in the early 20th century, and before that of Chinese people in the 19th century, that created certain public perceptions of Asian people and their culture that would be refracted now through the nativist lens and the Jim Crow lens of America in the 20th century. Here you might recognize the work in a different context of a popular American children's author and illustrator, Dr. Seuss. At the beginning of the war, Theodore Geisel, whose alias Dr. Seuss would become well known to families after World War II in the guise of popular books like The Cat in the Hat. Well, Dr. Seuss was doing wartime propaganda early in World War II, here showing the march of ostensibly Japanese Americans, suitably caricatured here as nearsighted and sort of bucktooth racial stereotypes, coming by to pick up what looks like to be blocks of TNT explosives, which they could then use to sabotage America's war effort. And Dr. Seuss, in fact, would publish many, many such cartoons during the war. That is to say, anti-Japanese cartoons, as well as other types of propaganda and patriotic cartoons. One more before we move on, announcing war bonds, urging civilians to buy war bonds. Again, showing in recognizably Dr. Seuss fashion, I think, for those of us who know his books from our childhoods, or those of our kids, a recognizable Seussian character here, you might say, but in wartime used to denigrate and demonize the Japanese. This happens, of course, more or less simultaneously with the government's actions. That is to say, the actions of the federal government to issue the so-called civilian exclusion orders following Pearl Harbor. This was officially a military command, but signed off on by the President of the United States, which would segregate all persons of Japanese ancestry first into detention centers on the West Coast, and then once they were constructed, so-called internment camps spread throughout the greater American West. That is, the removal of civilian people who possess so-called Japanese blood. And what was that? Well, it was enough that at least one of your grandparents was of Japanese descent. And most folks were given as few as 24 hours to leave behind their homes, their businesses, their schools, their property, their possessions, to leave it all behind and report to the government centers, the federal government centers, which were usually just improvised meeting halls in various locales throughout the west of the United States. In Sacramento, certainly throughout the Bay Area, Stockton, wherever there were populations of Japanese American people, some given as few as 24 hours, others up to 10 days, but in either case, a dramatic upheaval for those now caught up in the swirl of public and governmental anger and military suspicion, you might say, that what we would come to know as the Japanese internment in World War II would now directly challenge those more gleeful, more idealistic notions of American togetherness and unanimity in the broad democracy of the war, of the wartime effort. Japanese civilians were ordered to turn in all weapons, and that included samurai blades, which some Japanese American families had as ceremonial objects. They were also ordered to turn in to radios and to report to the government centers, basically with only the possessions that they could carry. And by war's end, upwards of 127,000 persons, men, women, and children, old and young alike, will be interned by order of the U.S. government. Now, the word interned was a kind of specialized key term referring to what was meant to be officially a precautionary measure by the government and the military in anticipation of what the military said could be the cooperation of Japanese American civilians with a expected invasion by the Japanese military of the North American mainland. So it was seen as a proactive measure to reduce that risk. But but the word interned was then a kind of soft pedaling, really, that allowed the government to suggest that this was also somehow for the protection of those interned. But many have argued since, of course, that this was nothing less than imprisonment, and the so-called internment camps nothing less really than concentration camps. And I want to point out your attention here in this picture where you see this trail of Japanese American families walking across what appears to be a bridge toward their location, their internment location headquarters. Right here in the left corner of the picture, you see what look like a couple of young men, civilians, standing by and watching. And what we know is that it was often the case, and you can see some folks here behind the fence in this part of the photo, was often the case that among the indignities experienced by those who were forced to report was that they sometimes had to walk a kind of gauntlet or pass through a kind of gauntlet of jeering, insult, shouting, in this case, what appear to be young people, but people gathered along the way who evoked that anger and that frustration toward these civilian people as symbols of the great, disdain and hostility toward all things Japanese. One of those whose families was interned was Jim Tanaka, a resident at the time of South Sacramento. As Mr. Tanaka pointed out, I was born and raised here, meaning Sacramento, meaning California, meaning the United States. He was what the Japanese called Nisei, that is, American-born kids of Japanese descent, and at the time of the war was ordered, along with his family, to report to the internment centers. Patted down by FBI, both men and women, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, daughters and sons. Jim Tanaka remembered that everyone was given a number to designate them and their identity by the military. He said it looked like a price tag hung around your neck. We lost everything, recalled Mr. Tanaka, whose family had had a farm and grew strawberries in the Florin area of South Sacramento. The shortness of the notice meant that trying to arrange for someone to take care of your home, your house, your farm, your business, to take care of your possessions, your automobiles, and that sort of thing, was a kind of desperate act. And you've had many reported instances of those who took advantage, coming in sort of carpetbagger style to buy properties for pennies on the dollar, or agreeing to take possession under minimal terms of cost, and folks really didn't have a choice, because if they unless they had someone more trustworthy, all they could do was padlock their businesses and pull the shutters on their homes, and hope that either neighbors or someone else might look out for their interests. As we'll see, that was too often, unfortunately, not the case. So the government establishes these internment camps throughout the West, as far east actually as Arkansas, but within a kind of radius of the western states, including California, Arizona, the Topaz Camp in Utah, and some others. Some of the most desolate, some of the most desolate, and I was about to say desperate locations that would remove the civilian population of Japanese American people from what were thought to be the vulnerable reaches of the Pacific coast. One of those camps near Delta, Utah, If you take Highway 50 today west across Nevada, you cross the Utah boundary within miles now of where the camp known as the Topaz Internment Camp was in Delta, Utah. During World War II, about 8,000 civilians will be interned at Topaz, making it Utah's fifth largest city during the war. Told by the Army we were being protected, said one internee, against angry civilians. Yet the machine guns were pointed inward, referring here to the military guards posted around the perimeter of the internment camps. Yes, there was this sort of half-baked notion that somehow, again, these people were being, quote, interned for their own protection. But both the machine guns and the barbed wire pointed inward, clearly to keep anyone from getting out. These were Army-built barracks, nothing fancy. One light bulb, mattresses stuffed with hay, no central indoor plumbing or heating or cooling. The folks interned tried to go on with life in as normal a routine as they possibly could. Note that they were asked by the military to have their children recite the Pledge of Allegiance in school every day. The Pledge of Allegiance, of course, to a country that had interned them. It wasn't until I was growing up, said Alice Harai, who was interned at Topaz Camp, it wasn't until I was growing up that I realized we went to prison. We went without a trial and without due process. Only 3 years old at the time she was interned, Alice Harai recalled, I was angry for a long time. So normal life, maintaining gardens, arts and crafts, and even baseball teams in addition to the daily school lessons. And as you see here in the picture, a camp barber shop. I think maybe one of the greatest challenges was simply boredom. Here you were in the middle of nowhere in a rustic military constructed compound. It's pretty much what your imagination could create, I think, that made it anything like normal. Of course, there was a great deal of frustration and consternation. The vast majority of these folks, not only born in the United States, the majority of the 127,000 or so, as many as 70 plus thousand, were born in the United States, were American citizens, but also, a great deal of shame and embarrassment having been labeled somehow untrustworthy or disloyal in advance of any actual proof of the matter. One of the ways that leaders of these communities in turn called for a shot at redemption, you might say, was to allow young men to serve in the military. Now, in the beginning, that is before Pearl Harbor, there were thousands, 5,000 or so Japanese Americans already in the military, but as soon as the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, the Army took away their guns and gave them jobs as custodians, not even allowed to work in kitchens for fear of poisoning. So the call will come out from the camps to give us another chance, that is to say, on the part of those in turn to allow young men to serve in the American military, to provide a kind of redemptive force, you might say. Ultimately, the U.S. military will agree and will form some new battalions, including, probably most famously, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which would see wartime service, whose soldiers would see wartime service exclusively in Europe. In some cases, others will be used by the Navy and the Air Corps, for example, in the South Pacific, mostly as interpreters. The actual combat regiments and the 442nd or Go for Broke Battalion, as it was called, will see upwards of 14,000 serving in Europe. And the Go for Broke label was a kind of rallying cry for the soldiers now serving, coming straight from the internment camps to serve in the war. The government made it clear, by the way, that to say no to this military service was to effectively renounce your citizenship and to expose you to further judicial prosecution and imprisonment outside the internment camps in federal prisons. And there will be those who do say no. But the majority will accept military service as a chance to, as I say, somehow redeem the reputation of Japanese American people. In fact, by the end of the war, no other combat regiment of similar size will win as many commendations for bravery as the 442nd. Today there is a stretch of Highway 99 stretching south from Sacramento towards Stockton that has been memorialized as the 442nd Highway. The 442nd will be involved in a rather infamous episode. You know, one of the reasons for so many commendations for bravery is simply that the commanders overseeing the 442nd so often put them directly in harm's way, and that was met by the determination, incredible courage and determination of the 442nd soldiers to prove themselves. And in one episode, the regiment incurred 800 losses to those killed and wounded in order to save the so-called Lost Battalion of American soldiers, a battalion of American troops that had been pinned down by heavy gunning in the Alps region, and in went the 442nd to rescue this so-called Lost Battalion. Lost 800 in the process, but eventually able to save 214 members of the Lost Battalion. If you do the math on that, typically you would see that a sure military defeat would result if for every 214 soldiers saved, 800 more were lost. But in this case, the losses were chalked up to the dedication of the 442nd. As Jim Tanaka, a member of that regiment, put it a bit differently, we were, he said, expendable. For all the commendations the 442nd received during the war, it's worth noting that none of them received originally the nation's highest military honor, that is the Congressional Medal of Honor, at least not for half a century. It wasn't until the 1980s that the United States Congress formally issued an apology to those who were interned, the families of those interned in World War II, and then a few years later, the military taking up the cause and reviewing the records of wartime service, deciding that some 22 veterans of the 44th, an extraordinary, astonishing number, would receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. One of those still living at the time the awards were announced in the year 2000 was former U.S. Army Private Shizuya Hayashi, who served in Company A, 100th Infantry Battalion of the 442nd. His award write-up had Private Hayashi charging a German machine gun position killing 9 enemy soldiers and taking 4 prisoner. So extraordinary honor and bravery on the part of not only Private Hayashi, but others similarly recognized a half century after the fact by the U.S. military. So, what do we take away from the wartime experience of Japanese Americans? What we take away, I think, is a story far more complicated, far more tangled, far more rooted in the conflicted racial and ethnic histories of the American people. Remember, World War II occurred, in the heart of the Jim Crow era and nativist eras of the 20th century, when not only was racial segregation the law of the land, but also was the common ethnic discriminations of various kinds. When Japanese immigrants came to the United States in the early 20th century, they fulfilled many of the oft proclaimed, ideals of Americans as immigrants. That is, work hard, invest in community, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and be loyal to your country. And no group of immigrants were more steadfast in these principles than Japanese immigrants, and proved to be quite successful in their own pursuit of the American dream, becoming business owners and farm owners, like the Tanaka family that owned a farm in South Sacramento, and yet often experiencing a backlash as a result. Here in California, the California legislature passed laws to limit the amount of land that people of Japanese ancestry could own. Housing ordinances were passed, real estate covenants were passed, forbidding the sale of homes to people of Japanese and Asian ancestry, that sort of thing. So this was embedded, this kind of hostility and discrimination had been embedded in the culture even before, decades before Pearl Harbor. But the war will bring all of that to the surface. And I think the example of Japanese internment will, in the end, shine a very bright light that would force Americans to take a hard look in the mirror at this tangled legacy. All right, so that's the end now of part 1 of our lecture on America during World War II. We'll resume the lecture in part